My name is Robert Sinclair. I'm 68 years old, and for 31 years I worked as a claims adjuster for a regional insurance company in Columbus, Ohio, which means I spent 3 decades learning how to read a document for the sentence that doesn't quite match the sentence before it. Folks, I want to tell you what happened to me this past spring, because I think a lot of you have someone in your family you love and don't fully trust, and I think you'll understand why I did what I did before I tell you how it ended. The teller's name was Diane. I'd been banking at that Fifth Third branch on Sawmill Road for almost 14 years, ever since my wife Eleanor and I moved into the house in Dublin, and Diane had been behind that counter for at least 10 of them. She knew my name without looking at a screen. She'd asked about Eleanor by name for the better part of a year after Eleanor passed, in that particular way people do when they understand grief doesn't come with an expiration date. On a Tuesday morning in April, I walked in around 9:40, stepped up to her window, and asked to withdraw $2,500 from my checking account for a roof repair I had scheduled that week. Diane smiled at me the way she always did. She typed my account number in. Then she stopped smiling. Not the kind of stopping that happens when a computer runs slow. The kind of stopping that happens when a person's eyes catch something their training tells them to handle very, very carefully. She looked at that screen a beat too long. Then she looked up at me, and her face was doing that thing where somebody's trying hard to look normal and it isn't quite working. She said, "Mr. Sinclair, would you give me just one moment?" She picked up her desk phone, turned halfway from me, and spoke low enough that I couldn't make out the words. She hung up, looked back at me, and said, "Someone's going to come speak with you, if you don't mind waiting right here." I said, "Diane, what's going on?" She said, "I'm going to get Mr. Alvarez. He's our branch manager. Just give him one moment." She said my name twice inside of a minute. Any man who spent 31 years reading claim files for a living knows exactly what that means. That's the sound of somebody trying to make bad news feel survivable before they've even told you what it is. I stepped off to the side of the counter, the way you do, and I waited while the rest of the branch went about its ordinary Tuesday. A young mother with 2 kids at the next window, an older fella filling out a deposit slip at the counter behind me, the everyday hum of a bank on a spring morning that had no idea it was about to become the worst morning of mine. About 30 seconds later, a side door opened, and a man in his 40s in a navy suit walked toward me with the specific expression of somebody who has been told exactly how to look for this exact conversation. He put his hand out. "Mr. Sinclair, I'm Marcus Alvarez, branch manager. Could I get you to step back to my office?" I said, "Of course." He walked me down a short hallway to a corner office, closed the door, sat down behind a desk with 2 monitors on it, and turned one of them toward me, slow and deliberate, like a man who's rehearsed exactly how he's going to say the next part. He said, "Mr. Sinclair, before I tell you what's happened, I want to show you something. At 8:12 this morning, someone came into this branch and withdrew the full balance from your personal checking account. That withdrawal was for $31,740. He let that number sit in the room for a second. The withdrawal slip had a signature on it that matched yours closely enough to pass our teller's initial review. Our fraud monitoring flagged the transaction about 10 minutes after it processed, and I pulled the security footage myself." He clicked his mouse. The monitor lit up with a camera feed, time-stamped 8 hours, 12 minutes, and 47 seconds in the corner, clear as day, because this branch had been renovated the year before with all new equipment. And there, at the teller window, was a woman, tall, dark blonde hair pulled into a low bun, wearing a green wool coat I would have known anywhere in the world, because I bought that coat for her 2 Christmases back. It was my daughter. I looked at that screen for a long time. Marcus Alvarez, to his credit, didn't say a word. He just let the silence sit there, because he understood, the way people who've done this job long enough understand, that some silences aren't meant to be filled. Finally, I said, quiet as I could manage, "That's my daughter, Melissa Sinclair Cross." He said, "Yes, sir. That's what we assumed, given the name on the account and the resemblance in our file photo of you." I said, "She has no authorization on that account." "None," he said. "No, sir. It's a personal account, your name only. The signature on the slip appears to be forged. We've placed a fraud hold on the transaction, which means the funds haven't cleared. As of right now, they're frozen." Frozen. I sat with that word a moment. I sat with everything underneath it, everything I'd already understood, quietly, for close to a month, and had spent that month getting ready for. I said, Marcus, I appreciate how you've handled this. I need to ask you something. Is the money still sitting in the account, or is it out the door? He said, the cash was physically dispersed to her at the window, Mr. Sinclair. But the fraud hold means it can't be moved, deposited, or converted anywhere else while our investigation is open. Effectively, it's frozen in place. If you file a police report today, and I strongly recommend you do, we can start the formal recovery process. I said, I'll need a copy of everything. The transaction record, the withdrawal slip, and a still from that camera. He said, we can have that ready within the hour. I said, thank you. I sat back in that chair and looked at the frozen image on his monitor. My daughter, in her green coat, standing at a teller window at 8:12 in the morning while I was at home with my coffee, having no earthly idea what she was doing across town. But here's the thing she didn't know. Here's the part of this story that changes the shape of everything that came before it. What Melissa didn't understand, standing at that counter with a forged signature in her hand, was that 4 weeks earlier, I had moved every dollar of my real savings into a different bank entirely. The $31,740 sitting in that third account wasn't my life savings. It was bait. It was the exact amount I had decided, very deliberately, I could stand to lose if it meant finally proving what I already knew in my bones. Because I had known she was coming for it. I'd known for a month, and I had spent every one of those days getting ready for this exact Tuesday morning. Folks, welcome to True Story. If you've got a father, a mother, a grandparent you love fiercely, drop where you're watching from in the comments. I read every single one of them. Let's get into how I got here. I spent 31 years as a senior claims adjuster for Buckeye Mutual Insurance out of an office on High Street in downtown Columbus. Started there in 1993, straight out of Ohio State, with a business degree and a talent for reading between the lines of a document nobody else wanted to read twice. By the time I retired in 2020, I'd handled more disputed claims than I could count. Homeowners, auto, a run of commercial fire claims in the late 2000s that made my career, honestly. My job, at its heart, was simple even if the work wasn't. Find the sentence that doesn't match the story. Find where the timeline doesn't add up. People lie to insurance companies more than you'd think, and 31 years of catching them taught me something that never once let me down. The truth is always sitting in the paperwork somewhere. You just have to be willing to look at it directly, instead of looking away because you love the person who wrote it. Eleanor used to say, I became an adjuster because I was a stubborn man who needed a job where he got to be right. She said it with a particular smile she saved for things that were both true and a little bit funny. Eleanor Jean Sinclair, born Eleanor Jean Whitfield in Zanesville, Ohio, in 1955, was the warmest person I ever knew. And I don't mean that as a decoration. I mean it was load-bearing. She taught 4th grade at Bridge Street Elementary for 29 years and treated every difficult 9-year-old like he was one good year away from turning into something wonderful, because she believed that all the way down. She kept a rose garden along the side of our house on Amberley Court that she babied from the first thaw in March to the first hard frost in November, and I never once understood how she knew which ones wanted sun and which wanted shade and which just wanted to be left completely alone. She had notebooks for it. She had notebooks for everything. After she passed, I found 4 of them in a box in the garage, and I stood there holding them for the better part of an hour before I could put them down. Eleanor died of a stroke in September of last year, 66 years old. No warning, no history of it in the family, healthy as a horse on a Sunday, and gone by Monday morning. I'm not going to walk you through what those first weeks were like, because that part belongs to me and it wouldn't serve the story anyway. What will serve the story is this: Eleanor died in September, and by the end of October, 6 weeks later, my daughter Melissa had asked me on 3 separate occasions how my estate paperwork was coming along. I have 2 children. My son Andrew is 41, lives in Cincinnati, teaches high school biology, calls me every single Thursday night without fail, and drove up to Dublin 4 times in the 2 months after his mother died without me asking him to once. He never asked me a single question about money or the house or what I planned to do with either one. He has his mother's warmth. He'd also told me twice over the past year, quiet and without any accusation in his voice, that he thought I ought to be careful with Melissa. I heard him say it. I didn't move fast enough on what I heard. Melissa Sinclair Cross was 44 years old, living out in Powell with her husband Gary and their teenage son. Gary worked in commercial real estate and had the exact right amount of charm calibrated for every room he walked into. Firm handshake, remembered your kid's soccer schedule, asked the right follow-up question at Thanksgiving, and in 11 years of being my son-in-law, he'd never once said a single thing to me that felt like it came out of him rather than out of a strategy. Melissa was my daughter, and I loved her the way you love a child who's made choices that turned her into somebody harder to be around than you ever hoped she'd become. She was smart, she was capable, and both of those things had been pointed in a direction for a long time that I'd noticed and refused to name out loud because Eleanor had always insisted Melissa would find her footing eventually, and I'd deferred to Eleanor's read on people for 38 years of marriage because she was almost always right. Eleanor wasn't here to be right about it anymore, and Melissa started asking about the estate within 6 weeks of the funeral. The questions came dressed up correctly. Her voice had exactly the right amount of concern in it. She mentioned a coworker whose father had died without an updated will and what a mess that had turned into. She mentioned that Gary had some background in estate matters through his work and would be happy to take a look at anything if it would help. She mentioned once, almost offhand, that the house on Amberley Court was probably worth a good deal more now than when we bought it, and that it might be smart to understand the tax picture before anything got decided. The house on Amberley Court, the tax picture. I wrote every one of those conversations down in a work notebook the same night they happened, dated, summarized because 31 years of adjusting claims teaches you that documentation isn't optional. It's the job, and old habits don't retire just because you do. By December, Melissa was asking about my online banking, said she was worried about me handling everything alone at my age, said Gary had helped set up automatic bill pay for his own parents, and it had made their lives so much easier. Said she'd be glad to help me get it set up if I'd just give her my login so she could configure it properly. I told her I'd managed my own online banking for 11 years without help and felt confident I could keep going. She said she only wanted to help. I said I appreciated that. I wrote it down. In February, I came home from the hardware store and found Melissa in my den. She had a reason, said she was looking for a photo of Eleanor's mother. She remembered being in a box in the closet, and that much was plausible. There were boxes in there. But when I walked in, she wasn't at the closet. She was at my desk, and she closed my laptop a half second before I fully registered it had been open. I didn't say anything that day. I wrote it down after she left, and I spent the following week going through my finances with the exact same care I'd have given anybody else's disputed claim. Every account, every login, every statement. I found two things. First, my personal checking account had been accessed from an IP address that traced back to Powell, Ohio, at 3:14 in the morning on a night in January. 4 minutes, no transactions made, but somebody had logged in. Somebody with my credentials. Somebody living in Powell. Second, there was an inquiry on my credit report. I hadn't made a pre-qualification request for a home equity line of credit against the Amberley Court property, submitted online under my name back in December. It hadn't gone through because I'd kept a credit freeze in place for years as a plain professional habit. But the inquiry sat there in black and white. December, the exact same month Melissa was pushing hardest about the online banking. I sat at my desk a long while looking at those two facts side by side. 31 years of this work teaches you what a finding looks like. It teaches you what it means when the pattern in front of you stops matching the story somebody's telling you out loud. I'd been filing this pattern away in the place you put things you aren't ready to call by their name yet. I was ready. The next morning I called an attorney named Patricia Ullman, 61 years old, handled elder law and estate disputes out of a modest office above a dry cleaner's on Sawmill Road, which I mention only because the space above a dry cleaner's tells you something about the kind of practice it is, and it's a good kind. A colleague from my old office had recommended her years back after his own mother's estate turned into a fight, and he described her the way one careful professional describes another thorough. Doesn't like surprises. Neither do I. I walked into her office on a Monday at 9 sharp with my work notebook, a printed summary of what I'd found, and a copy of my will, drafted back in 2018, untouched since Eleanor died. Patricia went through all of it without a word, the way the good ones do completely. No performance of shock or sympathy, just attention. When she finished, she set it down and looked at me. She said, "Mr. Sinclair, I want to ask you something directly. Based on everything you've documented here, do you believe your daughter intends to move against your estate?" I said, "I believe she's already in the process of it. The credit inquiry and the account login aren't coincidences. That's reconnaissance." She said, "And your son?" I said, "Andrew's warned me twice this year. He's not part of whatever Melissa's doing. I'm certain of that." She said, "What outcome do you want?" I said, "I want my estate to go where I decide it goes. I want Melissa to understand that I saw exactly what she was doing and that I'd already handled it before she got far enough to do real damage. And I want a record, because 31 years in this business taught me that the record is the only thing that matters when it's all said and done." Patricia looked at me a moment. "Those are all achievable. Let's talk about how we structure it. Over the following 4 weeks, with the exact speed and precision 3 decades of claims work makes second nature, here's what Patricia and I put together. I dissolved the old joint estate documents that still listed Eleanor as co-holder on 2 accounts. I set up a revocable living trust, the Robert J. Sinclair Family Trust, naming Andrew as successor, trustee, and sole beneficiary of the residence. I moved the Amberley Court property into that trust. I opened a brand new primary savings account at Huntington Bank on the other side of town, under the trust, and moved every real dollar I had into it. And then I left the old Fifth Third checking account open, with a balance of exactly $31,740. I left it open on purpose, because I understood, with the same cold clarity I'd bring to any file that didn't add up, that Melissa had my login and had been watching that number for months. Close the account fast, and she'd know something had shifted, and she'd change her plan. Leave it sitting there looking like my ordinary operating funds, and she'd see exactly what she was hunting for. I also called Fifth Third's fraud department directly and got connected to a woman in compliance named Sharon Betts. I told her everything I'd found and everything I believed was coming. I gave her the account number and told her precisely what to watch for. I asked her to flag the account for enhanced monitoring and to call me the second anything unusual happened. Sharon Betts said, "Mr. Sinclair, in 19 years doing this job, I've gotten a call like this maybe twice." I said, "How'd those turn out?" She said, "Both times, in favor of the person who called." I said, "Good. That's what I need." 4 weeks later, on a Tuesday morning in April, I drove to Sawmill Road to withdraw $2,500 for a roof repair, and a teller I'd known for a decade went still at her window. I filed the police report that same afternoon at the Dublin Police Department. The officer, a young man named Reyes, wrote everything down careful and thorough, and told me that given the amount and the strength of the evidence, this would go straight to the Financial Crimes Unit. He took the security still, the forged slip, and the full transaction record. The detective assigned was a woman named Carol Whitfield, no relation to Eleanor's family, small world, all the same, mid-50s, sharp, unhurried, who called me the following Wednesday and asked me to come in with everything I had. I brought everything: the work notebook with 5 months of dated entries, the account access logs showing the January login from Powell, the credit report with the December inquiry, a full written timeline of every estate-related conversation I'd had with Melissa from September through April, dated and cross-referenced against my own calendar. Detective Whitfield looked at that timeline a long while. "You put this together yourself." I said, 31 years reading insurance claims. I don't build documentation because I need to. I build it because that's the job." She said, "You have the login records confirmed by the bank's own compliance department." I said, "Yes. And I have the credit bureau report showing the December inquiry traced to the same Powell address as the January login." She was quiet a second. "Mr. Sinclair, between the camera footage, the forged signature, the credit inquiry, and your own documentation, you've built about as complete a case as I've ever seen walk through that door." I said, "That was the intention." She said, "Why didn't you come to us back in February, the first time you found the login?" I said, "In February I had an anomaly, a login from the wrong place at the wrong hour. An anomaly isn't a case. A case is what I had in April, with the camera and the forged signature and the whole timeline laid end to end. I needed the full shape of it before I acted. And now you have it. Now I do. She said, we'll open a formal investigation. I'll be in touch within the week. I called Andrew from the parking lot outside the police station. He picked up on the second ring. I told him everything. The bank, the teller, the camera, the police report, the January login, the December inquiry, the 4 weeks I'd spent quietly restructuring everything I owned. I told it to him start to finish in the order it happened, and he stayed quiet the whole way through, listening rather than waiting his turn to talk. When I finished, he said, Dad, how long have you known? I said, I've been building the file since February. I knew what it was by March. I didn't want to bring it to you before I was certain, because I didn't want you carrying something you couldn't act on. He was quiet another second. Then, are you okay? I said, I'm clear-headed. That's about all I can offer you right now. He said, you want me to come up? I said, not yet. Wait till I know the timeline on the investigation. There'll be a moment I need you here, and I'll tell you when. He said, okay. And Dad-Mom would have seen this coming a year ago. I said, I know. She was always faster than me on the people side of things. I'm good with numbers. People take me longer. He said, you got there, though. I said, I did. I drove home to Amberley Court and sat on the back patio in the April afternoon, looking out at Eleanor's rose bushes, which had gone a little wild without her hand on them. The bones of the garden were still good. She'd built it to last, but the fine details of it were softening at the edges, and I didn't have the knowledge to hold them where she'd left them. I thought about her notebooks in the garage. I went and got them. I sat out there for an hour reading her handwriting through 3 seasons of a garden she wasn't going to see bloom again, and for the first time I understood, in real detail, what she'd been growing and why, and what each one of them needed from me now. The investigation ran 9 weeks. Detective Whitfield called me 3 times, and I met once with an assistant prosecutor named Diane Kowalczyk, methodical, unhurried, who went through my documentation with exactly the care it deserved. What the investigation found: Melissa had gotten into my online banking through the laptop in my den during her February visit, confirmed by digital forensics on the session logs. She'd used that access to track my balances for something close to 5 months. She'd submitted the December home equity application, blocked cold by my credit freeze. She'd forged my signature on the April withdrawal slip and presented it at the counter, where Diane's training had caught it exactly the way it was supposed to. The forensic pull on her phone, done under a warrant Detective Whitfield secured in May, turned up a notes app where Melissa had kept a running log of my account balance for 4 months straight. The last entry was logged at 7:51 that morning, 21 minutes before she walked through the door on Sawmill Road. It read, balance this morning $31,740, doing it today. She'd been watching the whole time. Waiting for a morning, she figured I had no reason to check the account, no appointments, nothing pulling me toward a bank. She had no idea I'd put that exact Tuesday on my own calendar 4 weeks in advance. She had no idea I'd asked Marcus Alvarez to call me the instant anything moved on that account. She never knew about Sharon Betts in compliance, or the enhanced monitoring flag, or the new Huntington account across town holding everything the Fifth Third account only appeared to hold. She'd spent 4 months watching a number on a screen and walked into a building to take it, never once suspecting the building was already waiting on her. Gary, once the investigation reached the text messages and emails between him and Melissa about the plan, hired his own attorney, separate from hers, and gave a statement calling his involvement general awareness of what she was doing, expressing concern about how things had gone further than expected. Detective Whitfield relayed that phrase to me with the flat, dry patience of somebody who's heard general awareness from plenty of husbands before and has a firm private opinion about what it usually means. Melissa was charged in June with theft, forgery, and identity fraud. The case was built on the camera footage, the forensic account access, the phone records, and that 751 Notes app entry that read like a confession in her own handwriting. Her lawyer entered a not guilty plea. Trial was set for the fall. She never called me between the April withdrawal and the June charges. I never called her. Andrew kept calling every Thursday like always, and we talked about his students and Eleanor's roses and whatever was going on in Ohio State football that week, and we mostly left Melissa out of it, because there wasn't much use adding commentary to something already moving through its own machinery. I went back to see Patricia Ullman in June after the charges were filed to make sure the trust was sitting exactly where it should be. She confirmed it was clean, untouched by the criminal case, Amberley Court, and everything I owned fully protected inside it. I asked her about the $31,740. She said, "The recovery process is underway through the bank. Given the frozen status and how strong the evidence is, Fifth Third expects to make you whole. Might take a couple months, but it's recoverable." I said, "I know. I left that money there knowing I might lose every dollar of it if that's what building the case required. I didn't expect to see it again. Getting it back is a better result than the one I planned for." She looked at me a second. "Most folks in your position don't think about it that way." I said, "Most folks in my position didn't spend 31 years reading insurance files for a living." She almost smiled at that. Melissa took a guilty plea in September. Full restitution, a suspended sentence, 5 years probation, and a permanent mark on her record. The prosecutor called afterward to tell me it was the strongest resolution the evidence supported, and I told her I understood that and appreciated the work she'd put in. The restitution money landed in October. I deposited every dollar into the Huntington account and logged the date in my notebook, same as I'd logged everything else. Then I sat at my kitchen table with a cup of coffee and let myself feel that it was over, which is a different kind of sitting than sitting in the thick of something, and it takes its own kind of time to settle. Andrew drove up from Cincinnati the weekend after the plea. We sat out back in the October light, and he showed me which of Eleanor's rose varieties needed cutting back before the frost, because she'd told him once years ago, and he'd remembered it the way he remembers everything she ever said to him. We talked about Melissa once that afternoon, maybe 15 minutes, the way people talk about something that's settled but not entirely over. He said, "I keep trying to understand how it got this far." I said, "I think it's the same answer it always is with this kind of thing." She believed I wasn't paying attention anymore, and that belief felt comfortable enough to her that the whole plan turned real before she ever stopped to think about what actually paying attention looks like. He said, "She should have known you better than that." I said, "She knew me 30 years ago. She never bothered updating the file." He laughed, quiet. "That's a very claims adjuster way to say it." I said, "It's the only way I know how to say anything, son. The roses are doing better now. Not what Eleanor had them at, not her precision, not her patience, but better than they were in the spring. I've been working through her notebooks page by page, learning what I should have learned while she was still here to just tell me. And some mornings I stand at the kitchen window with my coffee and watch what's coming up along that fence line, and I think about how she built that garden, not for the season she was in, but for the one after, for whoever'd be standing at that window once she wasn't. I built my paperwork the same way, not for the day I'd need it, but for the day after that, when having it built right would decide what was still possible for me and what wasn't. The record is the record, and for the first time in a long while, it's entirely mine. If this one stuck with you, tell me down in the comments which part hit hardest and where you're watching from tonight. I read every one. Hit that like button for me, subscribe if you haven't yet, and I'll see you in the next one.